1961. Long before the world knew his name, before movie posters and philosophy quotes and myth-making, Bruce Lee was just a young Chinese immigrant trying to find his footing in a country that didn't quite know what to do with him. America liked his energy when it could package it. But outside of stages and screens, the welcome was conditional, uneven, and often hostile. Bruce was living in Seattle then, studying, teaching, hustling between jobs, carrying himself with confidence that didn't ask permission. And that confidence alone was enough to make certain people uncomfortable. The diner sat on a quiet stretch of road, the kind of place locals treated as neutral ground, where nothing important ever happened. Just coffee refills, fried food, and the soft hum of routine. Bruce walked in that afternoon, not looking for confrontation, just food and a moment to sit. He took a booth, ordered calmly, spoke politely, and waited. It should have ended there. It didn't. The waitress didn't bring his food. Mutes passed, then more. People who arrived after him were served first. White patrons, some of whom barely acknowledged Bruce's presence, were eating, laughing, finishing meals. Bruce remained seated, composed at first, then visibly aware of the pattern forming around him. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a busy kitchen. It was a message delivered through omission, the kind of racism that doesn't shout because it doesn't think it needs to. Bruce stood and approached the counter politely, asking about his order. The response was dismissive, clipped, edged, with the tone of someone irritated by his very existence. One of the men seated nearby laughed under his breath. Another muttered something about foreigners knowing their place. The words weren't loud, but they weren't hidden either. They were meant to land. In that moment, Bruce didn't explode. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He stood very still. People who later retold the story often expected a dramatic physical response because that's how they wanted to frame Bruce Lee, as a walking weapon waiting to be unleashed. But the truth is more unsettling than that. This was our dear writer, Mushmore. Bruce chose not to escalate physically because he understood something deeper. Violence in that moment would confirm every stereotype they wanted him to embody. Silence, on the other hand, gave him control. Bruce turned to face the room. He didn't shout. He spoke clearly, evenly, with an intensity that pulled attention without raising volume. He asked a simple question, one that cut through the noise, and landed directly in the center of the problem. Eddie died 6 years. And when he started fresh, he left his black eye. He asked why he was being treated differently. Not emotionally, not rhetorically, directly. The room quieted, because suddenly the behavior had to exist in daylight. One of the men smirked and said something about people like you not being from around there. Another added that Bruce should take his business elsewhere if he didn't like how things were done. That's when Bruce shifted, not in stance, but in presence. He stepped closer to the counter, not invading space, but claiming it. And he spoke again. Calmly explaining that he was a student, a teacher, a human being. What shocked people wasn't what he said. It was how unafraid he was to say it. This was a town where very few people challenged that behavior openly. Silence was the rule. Endurance was the expectation. Bruce broke that rule without anger, and that made it impossible to dismiss him as a troublemaker. He wasn't performing outrage. He was asserting dignity. The owner came out from the back, drawn by the tension. At first, he tried to smooth things over by asking Bruce to calm down, as if calmness had ever been the issue. Bruce looked him directly in the eye and said something witnesses would later remember clearly. He said that calmness without justice is submission, and he wasn't there to submit. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He connected without justice, and he wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for equal treatment. Food he ordered, service others received. The owner hesitated. That hesitation mattered, because behind Bruce, other patrons were watching now. Some uncomfortable, some curious, a few quietly embarrassed. The dynamic had shifted. What had been routine discrimination was now a public choice. Serve him, or declare openly that the diner practiced exclusion. There was no longer a polite middle ground. The owner told the waitress to bring the order. The food arrived. Bruce didn't sit immediately. He waited until it was placed in front of him, until the act was complete. Then he thanked the waitress politely and returned to his booth. He ate in silence. No victory speech. No lingering stare. Just presence. And that, strangely enough, was the moment people remembered most clearly, because it denied them the relief of drama. It forced them to sit with what had happened. After Bruce left, the diner didn't return to normal. Conversations sparked. Arguments followed. Some defended the way things had always been. Others questioned it for the first time. The owner reportedly received complaints not about Bruce, but about the embarrassment of being forced to confront behavior that had thrived in quiet. The town didn't change overnight, not because Bruce told the story, but because others did. Because people who had witnessed someone stand calmly against humiliation found themselves unable to forget it. A few days later, another Asian student was served without delay. Weeks later, so was a black patron who'd previously been ignored. These weren't sweeping reforms, they were small adjustments. But history doesn't usually move in grand gestures. It moves in altered habits. Bruce never returned to that diner. Bruce never returned to that diner. So one thing I would buy a book was with Dirty Dead. He didn't need to. For him, the incident wasn't about winning an argument. It was about alignment. He believed deeply that how you move through the world matters as much as how you fight within it. Racism, to Bruce, wasn't just a social problem. It was a failure of perception, a refusal to see reality clearly. and Bruce dedicated his life to clarity. Later, when he spoke about discrimination, he didn't frame himself as a victim. He framed the system as inefficient, outdated, and weak. He argued that prejudice was a form of mental rigidity, the same rigidity that gets fighters hurt when they refuse to adapt. In his mind, racism and bad martial arts shared a root cause: attachment to illusion. That diner incident shaped how Bruce taught. He emphasized self-respect, not as arrogance, but as non-negotiable grounding. He told students that confidence doesn't require permission, and that dignity, once surrendered, is difficult to reclaim. He taught them to stand their ground verbally before they ever needed to physically. That lesson would echo far beyond Seattle. Years later, when Bruce became famous and reporters asked him about racism in Hollywood, he responded with the same calm clarity he'd shown in that diner. He refused roles that reduced Asians to caricatures. He challenged producers directly, not angrily, but firmly. He didn't beg for inclusion. He demanded accuracy. And when accuracy wasn't offered, he created his own platform. People often imagine Bruce Lee's resistance as explosive. In reality, it was surgical. He chose moments carefully. He spoke when silence would cost him integrity. And when he spoke, he did so in a way that forced others to confront themselves. The diner incident wasn't unique because of what happened there. It was unique because of how Bruce handled it. That town never put up a plaque. There's no marker on the sidewalk, no official acknowledgement. But people remembered. They remembered a young man who refused to shrink, who didn't apologize for existing, who showed that standing up doesn't always require raising fists. Sometimes it requires refusing to move at all. That refusal changed the tone of a room. Then a diner. Then, quietly, a town. And Bruce Lee carried that lesson with him for the rest of his life. After that afternoon, the ripple didn't move the way people expect change to move. There were no apologies written in a local paper, no public statements about tolerance, no dramatic reckonings. Instead, the ripple moved through behavior, through pauses, through people catching themselves before repeating something they'd always done without thinking. That diner became a reference point, not because Bruce Lee returned, but because the people who worked there and ate there couldn't unknow what they'd seen. They had watched someone refuse humiliation without becoming violent, and that unsettled a hierarchy that relied on silence more than force. Bruce, meanwhile, didn't frame the incident as heroism. To him, it was alignment. He often spoke about the importance of living your philosophy rather than reciting it, and that day had been no different. He believed that dignity is not something granted by others. It's something you maintain through action. It is appearance that the baby sisters who put it together would end their lives and grant their parents. When friends later asked him why he hadn't simply walked out, Bruce answered that walking out would have taught the room nothing. Staying calmly had forced a choice. That idea shaped how Bruce navigated America in the years that followed. He became acutely aware of when he was being tolerated rather than respected, and he refused to confuse the two. In classrooms, studios, and meetings, he noticed how often people spoke over him, dismissed his ideas until they were repeated by someone else, or praised his physicality while ignoring his intellect. Injury. Each time, Bruce responded not with resentment, but with correction. He clarified. He asserted. He stayed present. In Seattle, his students noticed that Bruce didn't just teach punches and kicks. He taught posture, voice, eye contact. He corrected how people stood when they spoke, how they held themselves in conversation. Some thought this was unrelated to martial arts. Bruce disagreed. He believed that how you carry yourself determines how others test you. Weak posture invites pressure. Clear posture sets boundaries before conflict begins. The diner incident reinforced this belief. Bruce began emphasizing verbal assertiveness alongside physical training, reminding students that most conflicts are decided long before fists are raised. He taught them to recognize disrespect early, to address it directly, and to do so without apology. He warned them that avoidance often feels peaceful, but breeds resentment, while clarity, though uncomfortable, prevents escalation. As Bruce moved deeper into the entertainment industry, the same pattern repeated on a larger stage. He encountered producers who wanted him exotic but not authoritative, athletic but not articulate. They offered roles that reduced Asian men to servants, villains, or jokes, and each offer carried the same subtext he'd felt in that diner. Know your place. Bruce declined without bitterness, but with firmness, even when those refusals cost him opportunities. He understood that accepting diminished representation would reinforce the very attitudes he'd challenged years earlier over a plate of uneaten food. When he spoke publicly about these choices, Bruce didn't frame them as political. However, money doesn't exist in such a state goes away to the masks of research programs and mask address. He framed them as practical. He argued that inaccurate representation weakens storytelling and insults audiences. He said that if you want authenticity, you must allow people to exist fully, not as symbols. This framing disarmed critics who expected anger. Bruce wasn't pleading for sympathy. He was demanding competence. The town where the diner stood continued to change in small ways. New students arrived. New families moved in. The cultural makeup shifted gradually. And while no one credited Bruce Lee directly, those who'd been there remembered the moment when silence broke. One former waitress later said that after that day, she noticed how often she'd unconsciously delayed service to people who didn't look like her neighbors. She didn't describe herself as racist. She described herself as unexamined. You know what? That distinction mattered. Bruce believed examination was the beginning of growth. He often compared prejudice to rigid technique, arguing that both fail under real pressure. A mind unwilling to adapt, he said, becomes brittle. And brittle things break That philosophy guided not just his fighting, but his activism, if it can even be called that. Bruce didn't march or sloganize. He embodied alternatives. As his fame grew, Bruce gained access to rooms that had once excluded him entirely. Instead of assimilating quietly, he brought others with him, recommending Asian actors, insisting on fair treatment for stunt performers, challenging casting decisions that relied on lazy stereotypes. Yes, very much to one sister of stunt performers. He did this calmly, persistently, often exhausting people who expected either submission or outrage. Bruce offered neither. He offered consistency. That consistency made him difficult to ignore. Executives who dismissed him early on found themselves revisiting conversations they'd ended too quickly. Students who once underestimated him found themselves quoting him years later. All of us in my city was the baspo. The diner incident, small as it seemed, was an early rehearsal for this larger pattern. Bruce learned that standing up doesn't require volume, but it does require staying power. He also learned the cost. There were doors that closed permanently. There were opportunities delayed. There were whispers labeling him difficult, a word often reserved for people who refused to accept lesser treatment quietly. Bruce accepted that label without flinching. He preferred difficulty to erasure. In private moments, Bruce acknowledged the exhaustion that came with this stance. Constantly asserting dignity in hostile or indifferent environments takes energy. He trained harder not just for fighting, but for life. Anyway, I remember back in the day, we didn't start a period of dreams and life souls. He built resilience deliberately, physically and mentally, understanding that clarity requires stamina. He encouraged students from marginalized backgrounds to do the same, not by hardening their hearts, but by strengthening their sense of self. Nobody is yet deeply serving the people who need the sport, working to their hearts. When Bruce eventually left Seattle, the diner became just another building, eventually changing hands, perhaps even changing names. But the behavior inside it had already shifted. That shift didn't originate from policy. It originated from confrontation handled with discipline. Bruce never claimed credit for it. He didn't need to. He measured success by alignment, not acknowledgement. Looking back, the diner incident stands out, not because it was unique, but because it was representative. Bruce Lee faced racism repeatedly throughout his life, in subtle and overt forms. What made him different wasn't that he avoided it, but that he addressed it without allowing it to define him. He refused to internalize diminished expectations. He refused to perform gratitude for basic respect. That refusal became part of his teaching, his filmmaking, and his legacy. When later generations watched him on screen, they weren't just seeing speed or strength. They were seeing a man who occupied space unapologetically, who spoke clearly, who looked people in the eye, who refused to shrink. That presence resonated with audiences who had never seen themselves portrayed with such confidence. The diner didn't change a town forever, in the dramatic sense people like to imagine. It changed a pattern. It interrupted a habit. It demonstrated that racism often survives not through hatred, but through routine, and that routine can be disrupted by someone willing to stay present when silence would be easier. Bruce Lee was willing, and that willingness carried forward. Every time Bruce challenged a stereotype, every time he demanded fair representation, every time he taught students to stand firmly without aggression, the echo of that diner lived on. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about refusing erasure. It was about choosing clarity over comfort. That is how towns change. That is how cultures shift. Not through spectacle, but through moments where someone decides not to move out of the way. Bruce Lee made that decision early, and he never stopped making it